Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon.
And I'm Stuart.
We're both property people running our own businesses, and this podcast is just us chatting every week about the reality of anything and everything property. As time passes, it's often good to take a bit of a review and look at where you are and where you're going and what the future might hold. And with 2022 being about halfway through, in fact, just over halfway through now, this has been a sort of good point to do such a review. And this is something that Stuart and I have been doing and looking at in our businesses. And just before we started recording, Stuart was outlining his sort of top level approach. And that was to look at income and look at expenses and try to keep one bigger than the other. Is that sort of summing it up okay, Stuart?
I think that sums it up perfectly, and it's something I've been told is highly relevant in business, is to ensure that the income line exceeds the expenses line. That's apparently good business practice and has been what I've trying to focus on. And as you say, particularly if we think about the last couple of episodes where we've talked about what might professionally be called the headwinds that we are facing in the private rental sector with regards to all of the things we've talked about, Section 21, Section 24, etc., etc. And the two key areas are obviously income and expenses. And so where do I start? Well, of course, I think it's the same for every one of us. And I can hear people just chuckling away when we say it's about occupancy, isn't it? You know, number one, it's about being occupied as much as you can. Of course, now if you've got 2 or 3 one-bed buy-to-lets, that's very different to a portfolio where you're operating on a room-by-room basis. So there are differences. But for example, in my business, which I split into 2, so we have Lord Panda owned properties and then we have Lord Panda leased properties. And essentially those Lord Panda leased properties are those properties that we are renting directly from landlords to then rent out ourselves, which many people know as rent to rent. Now in the portfolio, we're now up to just around 60 rooms. So as you can imagine, that is, for me, a fair number of rooms to keep occupied. And typically we've been above 90%. My target is always 100. We used to operate on just over 98% actually, and that was based on just having one room void. And at the moment, we're operating at 86%. And the reason that is we took about 12 beds on little more than a week ago at this time of recording. And so it's very early days. However, we've already filled a third of that property. So we've already got 4 rooms in. So in my world, we're doing quite well. But that's the first priority, is how do I make sure that we are as close to 100% as possible?
I think, from my point of view, how you do that is you get rid of all your HMO rooms and you have nice, really simple buy-to-let properties. I've just looked up my numbers and I can tell you that currently I have 5 rental units. This is actually 4 properties, but one of them has a garage which is rented separately. So I've got 5 rental units and I am 100% occupied.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And looking back over the last 12 months, I can also tell you that I have been 100% occupied for the whole of the 12 months because I haven't had any tenant changes in the last year. So yeah, there you go. That's what you should do, Stuart.
It absolutely is. And if I could turn back time, I probably would. But that brings on actually nicely to the second element, which is, are they paying the right rents? So if we're 100% occupied, is everyone paying a room rate? And you and I had this discussion. It was on the podcast recently. You did decide to increase your rents on one of the properties. And I too have looked at that. So I had one tenant out of 60. It's a very small degree, but wasn't on a particularly competitive rate. And I then considered what that rate was compared to the rest of that house, actually, not compared to the portfolio, because it wouldn't have seemed fair to me, because as you can imagine, some properties are in a much better condition than others, depending on where they are in terms of the portfolio. And this particular tenant, his rate was 10% lower than any of the tenants. So of those on the lowest room, he was still paying 10% and actually had a really nice big room, big window. So it was actually a competitive room. So I just reached out to the tenant and the guarantor in this case and said, look, we're going to revise the rent. And actually the tenant was on a periodic, so it was just rolling. So it felt like the right time to me, and just said, look, given everything that's going on at the moment in terms of, inflation that's been done to death, cost of utilities, etc., it seems fair to me that we'll increase this rate. And I didn't give a percentage, but just for the sake of this podcast, it was somewhere in the region of 8 or 9% it worked out. So we increased the rent by about 8 or 9% and just said, look, as I do a new contract, want to increase the rate to this level. I hope that's okay. The response was the sort of response I love to get, which was, that seems perfectly fair to me. Just send it across. And that was how I brought that one room. But obviously in a portfolio of 60 rooms, can I hand on heart say I've done that as often as I should? No. But it certainly warrants a look.
So this is where I stop feeling quite so smug about my occupancy. As you mentioned, we talked about this a while ago, and you said recently, this was months ago. Time goes so fast, but it was months ago we talked about the rent increase that I was considering and then did actually implement for one of my tenants. And yes, that has gone smoothly. They have been paying the increased rent, but it's still well below the market rent for that area. And this is something that I need to make more of an effort to review and act on regularly. And I've now set up reminders in PaTMa to make sure that I actually do review them on the yearly anniversary of each tenancy. And while I don't have any expectations of being able to bring some of the tenancies back up to market rent, because I think they're just too far behind, I will at least now try and keep them ticking over and gradually increasing over time to at least not fall further behind. But do you have a process for doing that? And I mean, with HMOs, I assume you have a much higher turnover of tenants generally. So obviously every time a tenant turns over, do you review what the asking rent is for that room?
Yeah, in short, yes. So at the end of a tenancy, if they leave, we depart. And it could go both ways. The rent can go up and it can go down depending on the quality. And if I'm just step back a minute and we think about the levers that we're talking about, so we're still talking about income. The lever is 100% occupancy. Are they paying the right levels? And how can we ensure that occupancy stays longer for us? Well, it comes back to the quality of the environment that they're in. So that just comes back to your point, because I'm going to be completely transparent as well. I have a property where the quality of it has lowered in the last year and a half. It's a 7-bed property. It wasn't extremely high quality to begin with, but obviously with 7 people in it, that has lowered. Now, there are some challenges I've got with that, which I'm not going to talk about here, but let's just say maintenance hasn't been as up to date as it should have been, despite various requests. And what that means is that we've had to lower the room rate, which isn't something we wanted to do. So in terms of that occupancy lever, the other element that's quite key for us is ensuring that all maintenance is up to date, not just in terms of the basics, but in terms of the aesthetics as well. Because, the scuffs, everything looking not as great means that we are less likely to keep people for longer. So the life cycle of a tenant reduces and then the room rate drops down. So those levers are all quite key in regards to ensuring that income is at the level it should be. And obviously there's a rabbit hole of how we review the rents, but essentially it's just looking at what the room is. Is it still of the highest quality, and what is the competitive landscape looking like? And at the moment, it's quite competitive. There are a lot of people looking for rooms, but they now want much, much better rooms. They're not willing to accept a room that maybe a year ago they would have accepted because of quality.
So that ties nicely onto expenses, because if you're wanting to maximise your occupancy and your rent, you've got to have attractive properties, attractive rooms, as you just said. And in order to do that, you've got to keep the maintenance up. You've got to keep that property looking good. which is often difficult with lots of people living in it. And in order to do that, you've got to spend some money. So how do you decide what is the right amount to spend sort of between just a room tenancy and also perhaps on a larger property, perhaps even when you first get it as a refurb, you could always spend less and pitch at a lower occupancy and a lower rent, or you could spend more and pitch at a higher level. How do you decide where to go, and how does that feed into your overall calculations?
Well, I mean, I think if I were talking about projections, I'd probably look at around a 10% of income based on maintenance across the year, which can lead to quite a lot. I don't expect to spend that, but that's what I expect that it could go up to that, but I obviously hope that it doesn't. I hope that it's a lot less than that. But essentially what we do, which is what we're going to do soon, is one of the property that I'm talking about, is we'll have a walk around. Now, there's a lot of things that in my world are necessity that haven't been done, i.e. there's it's not a hole in the kitchen, but there's a divot where it bows down. That for me just should be done. It's not an aesthetic thing. It's just probably a health and safety issue first and foremost. But then we'll walk around and there's elements where it just needs painting. It'll be addressing what needs to be addressed. And if that means painting all of the communal areas, that's what we'll do. So for me, it's really just about making this what I would consider the bare minimum. And of course, that's a very subjective level, because we've all walked into properties, and I probably walk into this property now with fresh eyes going, oh, I can't believe that this is the level of it. And I've had several people living here. But of course, it's just one of those time things. We've left it. So it's really just a case of I'll walk around it with both the letting agent, if he or she is available, just so that they're aware, and also my maintenance person, just to say, right, these are and we'll grade it, essentially a high, medium, low. These are the ones that are high and absolutely have to be done. These are medium. I'd like them to happen within a very short period of time, but it's not urgent. And then the nice to haves, which we might do 6 to 12 months down the line. But for me, it's just making sure the property looks clean. And my kind of final line on it is as always, would I be happy for my children to live there? And some of the properties I walk in, and no, I wouldn't. And they're now my properties. So we have to address that. And that's kind of like our modus operandi, if you like, regards to property.
Yeah, I as you say, I think if you're going to property and I walk around it and can see that bit doesn't look great, or that bit's a bit concerning, or I don't think I'd like touching that, then yeah, it shows it needs fixing. And I tend not to do this very much during tenancies because it's whole property let, but certainly between tenancies, that's when I go in and quite often spend a reasonable amount in a single lump to bring the property back up to standard. So moving on from maintenance, what other expenses are you looking at?
Well, obviously the big one for everyone is utilities. And the way I work, because they are predominantly HMO / multi-let rooms, is I work with a fixed cost company. So they are essentially an aggregator of energy providers. So what they can do, what they can offer me, and they might not be the cheapest, but what they enable me to do is to create cash flow forecasts. So for example, what that means is I might buy a property, or I might take ownership of a property, or take rental ownership of a property, and they would agree that the gas and electric is going to cost £200 a month. Ha ha ha. But let's say it's £200 a month. Then I just know that is exactly what we're going to pay for the next 12 months per month. And there's no rising and falling, because one of the big challenges obviously we have as an HMO room provider is clearly between the months of September and February, March, the gas bills and electric bills are going to be much, much higher than they are during the summer months. And that really impacts our sort of cash flow for obvious reasons. So what I've selected one of these companies for is just to ensure that what I can now do is forecast and know what the level of expenditure will be month on month for a minimum 12 months. And we actually forecast longer than that. So that's how I do that. I actually bundle in other things as well, like council tax, broadband, and I think they're the key ones that go into it. Water, obviously. And all that means is I've just got a fixed cost. Now, of course, that fixed cost can increase now because of what's happening. But typically, I'm told when that's going to change. So, for example, they would say, OK, all of these monthly costs will last up until the 30th of June, which is now passed. And the next cost will be this, but that will last for 2 years. There will probably be people that might meticulously review these costs and say, well, actually, based on your tariffs, you're paying 15% more than you should do on an annual basis. I accept that, and I accept it because I'm happier to know what I'm paying than to have a better rate that's variable, and hopefully that makes sense. Well, it makes sense to me, but in terms of the words, it makes sense.
Yep, I think that makes sense. And I think it's interesting that you're not just fixing the rate or the costs of the energy and other supplies. You're also balancing that over the year. So every month is the same for you, rather than cheaper months in the summer and more expensive months in the winter. You've opted to just spread that evenly over the whole year and know consistently what those expenses are going to be. But you said the big expense, of course, for everybody is utilities. But what about mortgage interest? Surely you spend more on mortgage interest than you do on utilities. They haven't got that bad yet, have they?
Well, the big one, I guess, because utilities has been top of mind, but you're absolutely right, of course, with the interest rate rises that we've seen over the last month. Yeah. I guess I think about those less because the impact is coming down the pipe depending on where you are with your mortgage, your mortgaged fixed terms. So most products that we pick were either 2 or 5 years, and all of the products I picked in the early days were all 2 years. In fact, I think I've only just done a 3-year, but now, given the choice, I'd pick 5-year every time. Well, depending on all of the other factors without going into the ERCs and the arrangement fees, all things being equal, I think like most people, I'd probably pick the 5 years just because it pushes everything out far enough. Because like you said on the last episode, we're going to be pushing 5% soon. How soon, we don't know. But to answer that question, yes, what we want to do is review. And I know that PaTMa, for example, you can put your mortgage product dates in, which for me is a godsend because they're the little things that all big business banks on, isn't it? Like the insurance companies, we haven't talked about insurance, but like the insurance companies, they bank on our sloth as consumers. Well, I'll speak for myself, but I'm pretty sure they bank on our sloth because it's easier, isn't it? It's just easier to click a button that says continue. And in fact, we know that most of these will just continue unless we proactively do something about it. And it's not that we can't be bothered, it's just that life is busy, so we don't. And mortgages, I feel, is a little bit the same, but having had 4 mortgage products, and what happened was we had 2 properties, both with existing mortgages and with further advances on the same properties. They all went into SVRs, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole on this episode because that's not what we're talking about. However, what I can say is that, I nearly cried every day that I saw these amounts leaving the account because of the SVRs were around, I can't remember, but let's say 6-7% as an annual rate, so really high. But in terms of actual cost, it was like 30% more on those costs, compounded by the fact that the banks themselves just weren't getting round to dealing with it. So much so that we are trying to retrospectively get the additional interest paid back, and my broker is working on that at the moment, so hopefully that'll happen. But so for me, it's really key that those things get flagged to us and flagged in advance, because that was my issue. I didn't get to it quick enough. I still got it to it before it ended, but once you're in the hands of the bank, they can take as long as they like. So reviewing those products, making sure we're on the best products is paramount. And particularly where we've got a number of existing mortgages and further advances, it is as you say, a big cost to cover off.
Yeah, it's not something you want to suddenly see a 30% increase in. That's for sure. That's a big change and a big effect on something that is already a big expense. You mentioned PaTMa having reminders built into it for the end of fixed terms, which it does, which is brilliant and certainly something I would recommend for everyone, so you don't miss those deadlines as they're coming up. But something I've added recently is a page that sort of looks at all your properties in your current portfolio, and you can put in the kind of mortgage you might be getting now, and it will do analysis and calculations for you to work out how much equity you could potentially release, and then what the cost of the new lending would be, and indeed your new profit coming out of that as well. Anyone using PaTMa or would like to use PaTMa to give that a go, I do recommend it. It's quite interesting to play around with those figures and see how things would work out or could work out with different mortgage scenarios and situations. And something else I've added in there, sort of related to that, is a capital gains tax page. So with properties that you've had for a longer period of time, you can also add in that capital gains element. So you can sort of look at how much of that equity or the equity gain you would actually be able to keep after you've sold potentially and solidified that and had to pay the capital gains tax. But anyway, we are digressing a bit from the overall idea of reviewing our business portfolios or our property portfolios and the expenses and income involved. Is there anything else left on the expenses side of your balancing act?
Well, I suppose the other thing that it's probably remiss of me to mention, particularly in relation, stepping back to utility bills, is that we can set limits in terms of usage on tenants. That is, obviously, if whatever a fair usage is, and that's kind of like pre-agreed with agents, and I think in terms of ombudsman levels, is so you can say to each tenant, okay, you are allowed up to X pounds per month. So that also kind of mitigates the risk. I probably shouldn't say it publicly, but it's something we have in some of our contracts, not all. I wish we had it in more. But again, because of the fixed costs and knowing the nature of our tenancies, it's not something I'll get too hung up on. It will be the next area of focus for me, because in some properties we also have, timer stats, which we've talked about before, which just ensure that heating cannot be left on for 24 hours a day. So there's other things like that we can look at in terms of making sure that our energy usage stays within a reasonable, reasonable level. We've talked about, the water. We've mentioned insurance. I guess that's a fairly straightforward one, but just means, again, looking to see that we are at a competitive level. For us, HMO, unfortunately, the market is fairly limited. There's only one or two providers in the last few years that I've ever found will provide the right levels of insurance for the number of people that we have in properties, and that's going up as well. So in terms of those bills,
yeah, just on the non-HMO side as well, my buildings insurance seems to be gradually going up. Although, quick aside, I renewed my car insurance a month or so ago, and yeah, the suggested renewal from my existing company was within £5 for the annual rate of the comparison site best option I could find. So yeah, that was really nice to spend an extra hour or so going through comparison sites and decide that actually I can throw that hour away and stick where I am.
Yeah, I won't have that luxury, having been in an accident and several £1,000s going against my insurance premium. So I can only sit here green with envy.
Although, while we're talking cars, a quick follow-up from a previous car parts aside in the episode. Do you have your car back? Did they find the required missing car part and fix it?
Well, I did. I found the part. I got the part delivered, and yes, they fixed it. So after 5.5 months without car, I finally have the car back. And it's due to go back in 3 months. So, but I always look on the bright side. The bright side is I did much lower mileage in the car, although I've packed on about 2,000 miles in the last couple of weeks. So, but anyway, as you say, we digress. But there is an interesting point there around travel expenditure as well. We won't go into that, but obviously the cost of fuel is ridiculously high. So, as a business, it's thinking about how we can mitigate that. For me, it's fairly straightforward. I have to, I do the mileage I do, but can it cost me less to get the trains or anything like that? But any other tips that you've got from your portfolio about reducing costs?
Because my portfolio is so simple, being all single lets, I think I don't really have very much to say on this particular topic. As you say, keep occupancy high, keep those annual rent reviews in place, especially in a single let situation where you've got longer term tenants. Stay on top of those so the rents keep with market or close to market. And on the expenses side, really, there's no utilities to worry about. So it's much more about mortgages, maintenance and insurance. And we've mentioned all of those already. Stay on top of when your fixed mortgage rates expire. And other than that, just think carefully about checking the renewal rates and deciding what maintenance needs doing and when. And bearing in mind that sometimes it is worthwhile doing maintenance earlier rather than later. Try and capture those issues soon before they become bigger issues and cost more to fix.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of final tips. One is around council tax, which is for anyone with an HMO and those that are listening this far. If you do have a sort of working / professional household and potentially 1 or 2 students, it's worth looking at because you can get a reduced rate, or that room could get a reduced rate potentially. So always worth looking at that, because even if you save 5% of council tax, that's still £100 or a couple of £100 based on that. And the other point was just around yours about maintenance early. I spent quite a few £1,000s on a property where the roof kept leaking, kept falling in. Turns out that the issue was the guttering hadn't been cleaned. There was a build-up of leaves in the gutter, and so there was a massive water build-up. So what I've tried to do on a lot of properties, I haven't done them on all of them, and again, I asked myself why. We just need to action it, but it's just get an annual gutter clean on properties. It might cost a couple of £100-300 per property, which you think, that could be a couple of £1,000. But the money that could save in the long term, for me, is worth it. We just need to go on it. So those little tips there are definitely worthwhile.
And that, I think, is it for this episode. I hope you found some of those tips and things to look at and consider and review useful, and you can take them away and apply them to your own property portfolio and find some things where you can save some money or increase your income. And overall, I do hope you manage to keep your income above your expenses. And if you do, please let us know. Give us a shout on @bizofproperty, that's @BIZ of property on Twitter, or send us a message. You can do that through the contact form on thebusinessofproperty.com, which is also where you can find show notes for this and all past episodes. And Stuart and I will talk to you again next week.